When the black twins, Mona and Maya, enrolled at an elite private school where almost nearly everyone was white, they knew it wouldn't be easy, but they never imagined what was waiting for them. Yet when the bullying crossed the line into violence, the sisters were done holding back. What no one at Rosewood Hills knew was that the twins were black belts, trained by a renowned father who had taught them one thing above all: never lower your head to hate. The gates of Rosewood Hills opened with a mechanical hum, smooth and deliberate. The twins, Maya and Mona, stood still for a brief moment. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The silence between them had been built over years, stronger than any vow. The school grounds stretched before them in manicured lines and stone paths, as if someone had designed every inch to remind those who entered that this place was not made for everyone. It was a world where names mattered more than kindness, where uniforms fit like armor and smiles hid knives. And the moment the two sisters stepped inside, they felt it. They didn't belong. Over the years, they had learned that people often saw the color of their skin before they ever saw the person behind it. The air turned sharper with every step they took, not because of the morning breeze, but because of the stares. Cold, calculated, curious, not with wonder but with disapproval. Eyes slid across them like measuring tapes. Too dark, too different, too much. The whispers came next. Soft enough to deny, but pointed enough to wound. They walked anyway. Heads high, back straight, like they'd been taught. Near the front steps, Ryan Hilton's made his first appearance, flanked by his polished entourage. A group that moved with the relaxed cruelty of boys who had never been told no. His blazer was unbuttoned, tie loosened for style rather than comfort. He smirked before even opening his mouth, like the punchline had arrived before the setup. "Well, what do we have here?" he said with that half-laugh people use when they want to sound amused but mean harm. James, the boy beside him with perfectly tousled hair and a voice that reached just a bit too far, chimed in. "Careful, Ryan. I think they came straight out of one of those old VHS tapes, Rambo style. Maybe Daddy's an ex-mercenary or something." He mimed holding a machine gun, then ducked behind Ryan as if under fire. The group erupted in laughter. It was loud, unfiltered, and rehearsed, like they'd done this before. Maya didn't flinch. Mona didn't slow down. But the joke landed where it was meant to, not in their pride, but in their memory. They walked past the boys without a word, without a glance. But inside, something cracked. Not enough to break, but enough to remember. The day dragged on with the weight of 100 small wounds. No one said anything outright cruel after the joke. By the time they boarded the school bus home, Maya sat by the window, her cheek resting against the glass, watching the trees blur past like a film reel she couldn't slow down. Mona sat beside her, arms folded, eyes down, the silence between them tight with everything they didn't say out loud. They had made it through the day. Barely. But that small victory didn't feel like much when their inside still churned with embarrassment, with anger, with shame they knew they shouldn't carry but did. Neither of them spoke until the bus turned the corner near their street. "We're not telling Dad," Mona murmured. Maya didn't move, didn't blink. "I know. Not tonight." "No," Maya said again, this time a whisper. "He's got enough to carry." They stepped off the bus into the fading light, their shadows long on the pavement. That night, the house was filled with the gentle clicking of wind chimes outside and the low murmur of the TV left on in Derek's room. The light by his bed cast long shadows across his still frame. He hadn't walked since the accident, but he hadn't stopped watching. His eyes followed them now as they stepped in. "You girls okay?" he asked, voice gravelly from sleep and years of pain. "We're fine," Maya answered, and it wasn't a lie, not completely. But later, when Mona stood alone at the kitchen sink, the lights dimmed and the world quiet, she said it softly, just loud enough for Susan, their longtime housekeeper, to hear. If Uncle Sil were here, they wouldn't have said a damn thing. Susan didn't turn around right away. She was drying plates with slow, careful hands. "He said he'd come back," she finally said, setting one down. "Said he had to disappear before anyone else got hurt. But he promised, and Sil never breaks a promise." Mona nodded, barely. Her fingers rested on the windowsill, the night outside stretching like a question without an answer. In her room, Maya sat on her bed, eyes on the old photo tucked between the pages of a notebook. Derek, Syl, and two grinning girls standing on a beach, long forgotten. The smile on Syl's face wasn't the grin of a man who cracked jokes. It was the quiet, knowing look of someone who had seen fire and walked through it. They didn't talk about him much anymore. Maybe because it hurt, or maybe because in a world like Rosewood Hills, his name didn't feel like protection, it felt like a challenge. But tonight, the girls fell asleep with his name echoing just beneath the surface. The days that followed blurred together like a stretch of gray sky, unbroken, unmoved. Maya and Mona walked the same halls, sat in the same classrooms, but each moment now carried a thin, invisible weight. It wasn't just what was said aloud, it was what hovered in the spaces between words. The bullying didn't roar, it whispered. A shoulder slammed too hard in the hallway. Books knocked from hands with a fake apology and a smirk. Whispers behind cupped hands, sharp laughter from across the room that didn't have to name names. And always, always, the silence of everyone else. No teachers looked long enough to see. No classmates stepped in. The world around them simply tilted its head away and kept walking. That kind of silence was louder than shouting. By Wednesday, Mona had begun to count the bruises, not on their skin, but beneath it. Pride, trust, hope, all tender now, all marked by the small, deliberate acts of cruelty that added up like raindrops until they soaked through everything. That night, the rain finally came, soft and steady against the windows as the twins sat in the living room, homework open but forgotten. Maya was the first to speak, her voice flat with exhaustion, but her eyes still alive with fire. "You know what someone called me today?" she asked, not expecting an answer. "A monkey. Said I looked like I'd swung in from the Amazon, loud enough for the whole row to hear, and the teacher just kept writing on the board like nothing happened." Mona didn't flinch, just looked at her sister with that same quiet they had always shared. Maya let out a bitter laugh. "Funny, isn't it? They think calling us Rambo's kids is an insult. If they knew who Syl really was, if they knew what he did," she shook her head, "they wouldn't even dare to say his name." For a moment, the room fell silent again, but it wasn't empty. Mona leaned back, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, the old fan casting slow shadows that moved like memories. "They don't know anything," she said softly, "but they will." On the other side of the city, their father was not sitting still. "I need to see them," Derek said quietly, his voice firm despite the pain. Susan tried to dissuade him. The weather was damp, his spine aching, but he was already getting dressed, each movement slow and deliberate. With her help and the old van, he made it to Rosewood Hills. From his wheelchair near the front gate, unnoticed by most, Derek scanned the yard under a misting sky. Then he saw them, Maya and Mona, huddled near the east wing wall, knees drawn in, heads low. They looked small, not in size but in spirit, folded inward, trying not to be seen. His chest tightened. He had seen them strong, but this silent retreat cut deeper than any wound. That night, Maya went to him after dinner. The rain had grown louder by then, steady against the roof, like a rhythm she couldn't ignore. She sat beside his bed, took his hand in both of hers. The skin was thinner now, the strength of old stories replaced by the softness of quiet days. But the warmth was still there. She didn't say much, just let her fingers hold on. He already knew everything she wanted to say and everything she didn't. His grip, weak as it was, returned for a moment. It was small, but it was enough. Mona joined her a few minutes later, carrying an extra blanket and a book they wouldn't finish. She sat on the floor beside the bed, knees drawn in, and leaned her head against the frame. Outside, the rain went on. Inside, something held. The next day, the storm returned, but not the one in the sky. Ryan was waiting near the stairs, his arms crossed, Zach and Dylan behind him like shadows. He didn't speak at first, just stood there as Maya and Mona approached, the crowd parting instinctively. Then, with that practiced grin, he stepped into their path. "Still walking around like you matter," he said, his voice casual but edged. Still think this place is yours to walk through. Maya didn't answer. Neither did Mona. They stepped around him, their silence louder than anything he could have thrown at them. But that silence, so steady, so practiced, it didn't satisfy him anymore. Zach stepped forward, letting his shoulder brush hard against Mona's. She didn't stop, but her jaw clenched. "Oops," he said, not even trying to sound sorry. They kept walking. They always did. That weekend was not peaceful. It started with laughter, loud, forced, and far too confident. Maya heard it from the kitchen before the knock even came. Through the blinds, she caught the flash of Ryan's varsity jacket. James's phone lifted high, already recording. They were out front in full performance mode, their jeers bouncing off the quiet house like rocks against a window. "Hey, Rivers girls!" Ryan shouted, voice laced with mock sincerity. "We came to apologize. Real mature, right?" James added with a grin. "We're doing a little TikTok series. Thought today's episode could be called The Rambo Twins Exposed." The others laughed, nudging each other like kids who knew they were pushing the line, but were too used to getting away with it. Maya stood still, her hand hovering near the doorknob. Mona was at her side in seconds, eyes sharp. "Let me open it," Maya said. "No," Mona replied. "Let us open it." The door creaked open, slow and deliberate. Maya stepped out first, calm and poised. But it wasn't her presence that made Ryan's grin slip. It was the man who followed. Tall, broad, weathered like old oak, eyes that didn't blink. Ryan's jaw moved, but no sound came. James lowered his phone in slow motion. The other two stepped back, bumping into each other like they'd forgotten how feet worked. "You Sylvester!" Ryan stammered. "That's not... No way! You're not real!" The man didn't answer right away. He just looked at them, long and hard, like someone who'd spent a lifetime spotting fear under all the noise. Then, in a voice that felt too familiar to be real, too deep to be fake, he spoke. "You boys came here looking for trouble," Sylvester Stallone said, folding his arms. "You found the wrong house." James blinked. "No, wait, this is a prank, right? This can't actually be..." Ryan tried to laugh, but it caught in his throat. "Dude, that can't be him." Maya stepped forward, voice steady. "It is. He's our godfather." The word godfather landed like a punch. "You're joking," Ryan muttered, but his voice had lost its edge. Mona crossed her arms. "Want to tell your followers that you just tried to prank Rambo's family?" Sylvester's gaze never left Ryan's face. "You think it's funny, coming to a quiet home with your jokes and cameras, but out there," he nodded to the street, "that's your playground. This is my line." One of the boys stepped back so fast he nearly tripped over the hedge. James stared, mouth hanging open, still clutching his phone but no longer recording. Ryan's smirk twisted into a grimace. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Sweat beaded along his hairline. He looked between the man he once mocked and the two girls he thought were easy targets. "This is messed up," he muttered. "Let's get out of here." And just like that, they turned. No comebacks, no smug glances, just the sound of retreat, fast footsteps on pavement and the slam of car doors. When the engine roared to life and the car peeled away, the street fell quiet again. Sylvester let out a breath, slow and deliberate. "Kids these days." Maya turned to him. "You really didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said, eyes still on the gate. "I did." Inside, the air felt lighter, though none of them said so. In the hallway, Derek's voice rang out, weak but warm. "Syl? That you?" Sylvester smiled slightly. "Told you I'd drop by." From that day on, he never announced himself. He didn't need to. He came and went quietly, watched over the house like a sentry carved from old stone. No more cameras showed up. No more pranks. The whispers started as a murmur, barely more than static in the corridors. But soon, they took on shape, like smoke signaling something burning underneath the surface. Some said he was a mercenary. Others said he was special forces, retired after something too dangerous to speak of. One girl swore he once disarmed a man in a supermarket with just a shopping bag. Truth didn't seem to matter. The name alone was enough, Sylvester. He had never set foot in Rosewood Hills, not officially, but his shadow began to stretch long across the school. And Ryan Hilton felt it. Not all at once, but in the way the other boys looked at him, less certain now, less amused, in the way some students, once eager to laugh, now held back. Fear doesn't need facts. Just the idea of someone like Sylvester waiting in the wings was enough to shake the illusion of control Ryan had worn like a second skin. So he made a plan. If he couldn't control what people whispered, he would control what they laughed at. And he would make sure they laughed at Maya and Mona loud enough to drown out everything else. It happened on a Wednesday. The air had that brittle feel of early fall, cool on the skin, dry in the throat. Maya opened her locker first. The paint hit her nose before her eyes could make sense of it. Red, slashed across the inside wall, dripping down like blood. Monkey see, monkey do, go back to the jungle. Sticky notes covered the door, each one with a slur, a caricature, a crude drawing meant to reduce them to something small and shameful. Someone had printed out photos from social media and defaced them, drawing ropes around necks, labeling their faces with names that didn't belong to them. Laughter echoed before they even turned around. It came in waves from every corner of the hallway. Some students pointed. Some covered their mouths, pretending not to find it funny. But their eyes betrayed them, lit with amusement, or worse, relief that they weren't the target. Maya stood still, jaw clenched, her heart thudding so loudly it drowned out the noise. Mona didn't move at first either. But then, something in her chest cracked wide open. Her hand trembled at her side. She turned, not to look at the crowd, but away from it. And the tears came without warning. Hot, fast, and blinding. It was the first time either of them had broken, and Ryan saw it. From across the hall, leaning against a locker like he owned the oxygen in the room, he smiled. A slow, satisfied smile that said, "This is the moment I've been waiting for." Later that evening, the sun sank low over the neighborhood, brushing the rooftops with a quiet amber light. Inside the Rivers home, silence sat like a guest no one had invited. Dinner was untouched. The girls didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Sylvester had been in the living room all afternoon, sitting with Derek, eyes fixed on the television, but not really watching. He didn't speak when they walked in. He didn't ask what happened. But he saw Mona's red eyes, Maya's still hands, and he understood. He stood without a sound, walked over to them, and placed one large, calloused hand on each of their shoulders. "It's time," he said softly. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I can't fight for you, but I can teach you how to make them think twice before trying again." No questions were asked, no speeches made. The answer had already lived inside the girls, waiting for someone to open the door. That night, the backyard came alive with breath and motion. Sylvester moved like a man who had known violence, not just in theory, but in muscle and memory. He didn't bark orders. He didn't explain his past, but every word he spoke carried weight. "Balance isn't just on your feet," he told Maya. "It's here." He tapped her temple. "Control means knowing when not to strike," he said to Mona, steadying her stance, "but also knowing how, when the time comes." Each night that followed, the backyard echoed with the rhythm of training. The thud of fists on pads, the short, sharp calls of exertion, the hiss of breath pulled deep into lungs. But what they were learning went beyond fists. They learned how to read movement, how to ground their fear, how to listen not to the noise but to the moment. Sylvester didn't promise to protect them. He promised to prepare them. And as the leaves began to fall outside, inside, something else was rising, slow and steady. Not revenge, readiness. It was just before the lunch bell when the air shifted at Rosewood Hills. Not in any loud or sudden way, but like a stillness settling before a storm. Maya and Mona stepped into the courtyard like they always did, side by side, eyes forward, posture quiet but unshakable. They didn't notice the way students began forming a loose circle until they were halfway across the stone path, and even then, they kept walking, as if the weight of curious glances had long since lost its sting. From the far end, Ryan stood beneath the old sycamore tree, a smug half-grin pulling at his face. Beside him, Zach and Brent moved like shadows, not quite hiding their intent. There was a hum in the crowd. Phones were already out, screens glowing in eager palms. Becca, Tinsley, Marcus, Jaden, names the twins had heard but never really spoken, stood among the spectators, their eyes alight with expectation, as if this were nothing more than a lunchtime show. Ryan clapped twice, sharp and theatrical. "All right, everyone, place your bets, Rambo twins versus reality." Laughter scattered through the crowd, but it was thin, too rehearsed, too forced. Then he moved. A quick shove at Maya's shoulder meant to look accidental. Brent followed with a bump into Mona's back. Zach called out, "Let's see those black belts in action, ladies. Don't hold back now." It wasn't subtle, but it was exactly the kind of scene Ryan had planned. Lure them in, provoke them just enough, and let the cameras do the rest. Turn their silence into spectacle. But what Ryan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Maya and Mona hadn't just been taught how to defend themselves. They had been trained to know when to act. Maya's eyes flicked once toward Mona. No words were exchanged. They didn't need them. Zach lunged first, cocky and loose, aiming a slap toward Maya's head. She sidestepped, pivoted her hip, and brought her leg around in a swift arc that caught him across the ribs. He staggered backward, arms flailing, before collapsing to one knee. Brent went for Mona with a grunt, trying to grab her arm. She turned with the motion, dropped her weight low, and locked his shoulder in a smooth arc that sent him flat onto the ground with a thud. The courtyard fell silent. Even Ryan, halfway through his second taunt, froze mid-step as Maya turned toward him. He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes now. He reached out, too slow. She caught his wrist mid-air, twisted, and brought him down hard across the stone tiles. The crowd gasped. And then, for a beat, no one moved. Naomi stepped forward from the back, her voice ringing clear. "Let's go, girls!" Kayla clapped once. Lana followed. The ripple became a wave. From the far end, Jaden stood, phone steady in his hands. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were fixed, focused, capturing every second. The phone didn't shake. He made sure of it. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a joke. This was justice. And he filmed it all. Teachers lingered on the edges. Ms. Bell, arms crossed, pretending to scan the horizon. Mr. Morrigan fidgeted with his clipboard, eyes flicking down. Neither of them stepped in. Not yet. And maybe that was the point. When it ended, Zach was still gasping for breath. Brent didn't get up right away. Ryan sat dazed, staring at the sky like it had betrayed him. Maya stepped back beside her sister. Their breathing was steady. Their hands didn't shake. And no one laughed. That evening, the sun spilled gold over the backyard fence, painting the woodshop in warm light. Sylvester stood beneath the porch overhang, a rag slung over his shoulder, sawdust still on his boots. He watched them approach, didn't speak right away. Just nodded once and let the silence fill the space between them. "I heard," he said finally. Didn't have to ask. Maya folded her arms, not defensive, just grounded. "We didn't start it." "No," Sylvester said. "But you finished it." Mona looked away, lips pressed tight. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Sylvester stepped forward, his eyes clear beneath the shadow of his brow. "You did what you were trained to do. But what I'm proud of is you waited. You didn't swing first." He looked at each of them, like he was measuring not their strength, but their restraint. "People think fighting is about fists," he said quietly, "but it's really about choosing your moment and knowing what comes after." By the time the afternoon sun stretched long over the quiet streets of Elmridge Lane, the news had already traveled far beyond the schoolyard. Whispers turned to phone calls to outrage, and outrage, of course, to Sandra Mallory. Her voice, sharp as glass, cracked through the phone line in Principal Harrington's office, demanding explanations he could not give and threatening consequences he could no longer contain. The twins' names were now words she spat with venom, and her fury had found a direction, straight to the river's doorstep. It was just past 5 when the Mallory's black SUV screeched to a stop in front of the house. The slam of the doors echoed like warning shots across the neighborhood. Greg Mallory stepped out first, broad shoulders tense, fists already clenched, jaw locked. Sandra followed behind, her heels clicking against the pavement with theatrical precision. She didn't bother knocking. Her voice rose before her feet reached the porch. "Get out here!" she barked toward the house. "You think this is over? You think we'll let you raise violent thugs and walk away like nothing happened?" Inside, Derek remained still in his chair by the window. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just watched. Sylvester, standing just behind the screen door, said nothing either, not at first. His frame filled the doorway, quiet but unmoving, like a shadow that had been waiting to take shape. His eyes, calm and cold, followed the chaos as if he had seen it all before. Because he had. Greg stepped onto the porch, face flushed with the kind of anger that doesn't wait for logic. "You think your girls can lay hands on my son and there won't be a price?" he growled. "You've made a big mistake, old man." Sylvester's hand tightened once on the rail. "Back off, Greg," he said, voice low, calm. "Walk away." But Greg didn't. He lunged. The swing came wide and sloppy, fueled by ego, not skill. Sylvester stepped aside, catching Greg's wrist mid-air with one hand and using the other to flip him clean over his own momentum. Greg hit the porch with a grunt, sprawled awkwardly, wind knocked from his lungs. Sandra screamed, charging up the steps, hair wild and eyes burning. "You're a monster!" she shrieked, reaching for Sylvester's arm. "You're teaching children to attack people!" But before her hand could land, Sylvester turned with graceful precision, catching her wrist and folding it gently but firmly behind her back. Not to hurt her, just to stop her. "I don't teach them to attack," he said, voice steady as stone. "I teach them to know when it's no longer safe to walk away." From across the street, Mr. Gerard lowered his newspaper and raised his phone. Angie stepped out of her kitchen with her camera already recording. And from behind a curtain, old Miss Lillian peered out with a look that said she'd seen enough to know who was who. One of them, no one could say who, made the call. When the police cruiser pulled onto the street, the sirens stayed silent. There was no need. The neighborhood was already watching. Greg, now upright but humiliated, tried to shout over the truth. "We were attacked! He threw me down!" Sandra echoed him, louder, wilder. "He assaulted me! This is outrageous! Arrest him!" But the officers weren't in a hurry. They had already been shown the footage. Angie walked across the street with her phone in hand, the screen lit with a clear, uninterrupted recording. Mr. Gerard added, "You might want to hear from Lillian, too. She saw the whole thing from her porch." As the officers reviewed the clips and took statements, one turned to Greg. "Sir, we need you to place your hands behind your back." Greg exploded. "You're arresting me? After what he did?" The officer didn't argue. The cuffs clicked in place and Greg's voice broke into a mix of disbelief and rage. Sandra continued to protest, but her words landed in the thick air like feathers, heard but no longer believed. Back on the porch, Sylvester stood in the same spot where it all began. One officer approached him cautiously, expecting resistance, but Sylvester only stepped aside, opened the door, and gestured inside. "Tea?" he asked with a calm that was not for show. The officers hesitated, then followed. Inside, the house was still and warm. Derek looked up from his chair, offering a faint nod of recognition. Sylvester poured 3 cups and set them on the table, not a word of anger in his movements. "We don't go looking for fights," he said, his voice quiet as he placed the last cup in front of the officer. "We just don't pretend to run from them." The lights in the interrogation room buzzed with a soft, steady hum, the kind that reminded you time was moving, even if everything else felt suspended. Sylvester sat at the metal table, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, not from age or exhaustion, but from the weight of memories carried too long in silence. Across from him, Maya and Mona sat side by side, their postures straight, their faces unreadable, so much like Derek once was when facing a challenge. The officer beside them clicked on the recorder and gave a brief nod. But Syl didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the two young women in front of him, and when he spoke, his voice didn't belong to the room, it belonged to the past. "Your dad," he began, letting the words find their place, "was the kind of man who could fix a machine with one hand and hold the world steady with the other. We met in the desert. He was a technical officer, sharp as a whip, kept the equipment running when the rest of us were running on fumes." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. He hated chaos. Said the world had too much of it already. He believed in systems, in order. But more than that, he believed in people. When I got discharged and the cameras came calling, he stayed. Built a family, a home. And when the accident happened, when I heard he couldn't walk, I packed up everything and came back. No movie script was worth more than the man who once dragged me out of a blown-up convoy. Maya's fingers fidgeted slightly in her lap. Sylvester noticed but didn't comment. Instead, his voice softened. "Those sessions in the backyard, those weren't about fighting. I never taught you to hurt anyone. I taught you to listen to yourselves, to know where your center is, so that when the world tries to push you down, you remember how to stand." The door opened with a gentle knock, and the officer re-entered with a folder thick with evidence. He laid it on the table, and for the first time in the conversation, the focus shifted from memory to the moment. "Jaden's footage just came in," the officer said, flipping open the file. "Clear shot of Brent making the first move. We also have Naomi's formal statement. She heard Brent use the phrase, 'teach those two monkeys a lesson' the day before the incident." Sylvester's jaw clenched briefly, but he said nothing. Maya's eyes flashed, and Mona's hands curled into tight fists. "And this," the officer continued, pulling out a USB stick, "is from your neighbor's security camera. Full audio and video of the Hiltons arriving at your doorstep, screaming, threatening, swinging first." He turned to Sylvester. "It's over. They won't walk away from this." Syl nodded once. Not triumphant, just steady. Later, in the break room, the harshness of the world gave way to a softer kind of quiet. The vending machine hummed in the corner. The coffee pot gurgled behind them. Syl sat in an old plastic chair, a paper cup in hand. The twins sat nearby, not as suspects, not even as victims, just as people who had been through a storm and come out the other side. Maya's voice broke the stillness. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't shown up, where would this all have gone?" Syl looked at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners, weathered by sand, time, and too many things left unsaid. "If I hadn't shown up," he said, "I wouldn't have had anyone worth showing up for." She blinked, her throat tightening. "You too," he continued, his gaze drifting between them. "Remind me what all those years meant. I didn't come here to save anybody. I came because I saw fighters standing tall, and I knew they just needed someone to cover their six." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Don't thank me. You already did the hard part." There was a long pause. Then, without a word, Mona stood and walked behind him. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, resting her cheek lightly against the back of his head. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it didn't need to be. It was full. Honest. Sylvester set his cup down and reached up, brushing his rough hand gently over her hair. For a moment, his whole body seemed to exhale. Rosewood Hills had never known silence quite like this. Not the hush of discipline or the calm before a bell. This was something heavier. A stillness that settled into the walls, into the polished floors and trophy-lined hallways. Rumors no longer fluttered through the corridors like careless birds. Now, they moved with purpose. Whispers turned into questions, and questions found their way to desks of those who once believed they were untouchable. Principal Harrington, once the stern voice behind school announcements and closed-door decisions, now found himself under investigation. Letters had arrived. Dozens. Typed, handwritten, some trembling with anger, others soaked in quiet pain. Students, finally, had spoken. Not just Maya and Mona. Not just the ones who had fists thrown at them or insults carved into lockers, but those who had watched, those who had turned away out of fear. The silence had cracked, and once it did, there was no sealing it again. Miss Bell, who once looked down when names were whispered in venom, now sat in front of a review board, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Mr. Morrigan, who had pretended not to hear the sneers in his classroom, stumbled through explanations that even he didn't believe. Change hadn't come in flames or fury. It came in statements, in truth laid bare, in voices that had waited too long to rise. Among them were Naomi and Jaden. Naomi, who used to clutch her books a little tighter when Ryan walked by. Jaden, who had filmed the bullying but tucked the footage away out of fear. Now, they stood in front of their peers and said what should have been said long ago. We saw it. We didn't speak. But we will now. Their words didn't ring out with drama. They didn't need to. They landed with the quiet weight of truth. And then came the day Sylvester returned. He didn't wear anything dramatic. Just a simple coat, scuffed boots, and a scarf Derek once gave him. Faded red, frayed at the ends. He didn't walk with swagger. He didn't speak in threats. He entered the school auditorium the way you enter a place you've seen burn and bloom again. The room was packed. Students fidgeted, some unsure why they were there. Others sat still, curious. The air buzzed with something like anticipation, but deeper. When Sylvester stepped onto the stage, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply told his story. About being told he'd never amount to anything. About standing in front of closed doors, not because he lacked ability, but because of the name he carried or the color of his hands. About learning not to beg for respect, but to earn it quietly and completely. Don't let the world tell you who you are, he said, voice steady. Show it. And when they doubt you, let them watch. The auditorium didn't cheer. It didn't move. It held its breath. Even the ones who had once laughed with Ryan sat frozen. Marcus, always on the edge of cruelty just to survive, bowed his head. His hands clenched between his knees. Tears clung to his lashes, though he tried to hide them. No one mocked him. Not this time. When the speech ended, the silence broke, not with noise, but with the kind of stillness that lingers after something holy has been spoken. The applause came slow. Then it grew. Not wild, not theatrical, but honest. Real. In the days that followed, something shifted. Jaden's video, once hidden in a folder he couldn't bear to open, was shown at a school assembly. It wasn't played to shame. It was played to teach. And the faces of Maya and Mona, standing calm while chaos raged around them, became more than a memory. They became a lesson. A group of girls, some of them once strangers to each other, formed a club. Sister Strength, they called it. Their logo, two silhouettes side by side, wind swirling behind them like armor. The twins were no longer called weird or too intense. They were called the Storm Twins, not because they brought violence, but because they weathered it and stood taller after. After the assembly, when the students had filed out, Sylvester stayed behind. The rows of seats now sat empty, dust dancing in the light that poured through high windows. He walked slowly to the edge of the stage, then turned to face the quiet. His scarf fluttered in a breeze that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. He looked to a seat near the center, a seat no one had taken that day. He stood there a moment, letting the silence settle. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "You see that, brother? The kids did it." The house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that holds meaning. It wasn't the hush of grief or waiting, but something gentler, like the air itself was pausing to listen. Derek sat in his armchair by the window, the light pooling at his feet, casting long shadows across the rug. On his lap lay a folded newspaper. The front page softened from where his fingers had traced it over and over. The headline read, "Strength in Silence, a story of justice at Rosewood Hills." Beneath it, A photo of Maya and Mona, not in battle stance or defiance, but simply standing. Shoulders squared, eyes steady. Across the room, the girls were talking to Sylvester. They laughed softly, their voices dancing between memory and present. Sylvester leaned forward, elbows on knees, nodding, listening. A man built for movement, now content to simply bear witness. His silvered hair caught the sun, but it was his eyes, sharp, steady, deeply proud, that said the most. Derek didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He watched them with a quiet that held more than words ever could. His gaze moved from one daughter to the other, pausing at their hands, their posture, the way they held space now like it belonged to them, no longer shrinking to fit anyone else's comfort, no longer apologizing for being seen. The newspaper rested against his thigh, slightly wrinkled where his hand had gripped it too tight earlier that morning. He had read the article 3 times. Each word felt heavier than print, like someone had finally written what the world had tried so long to ignore. And though his voice was thin these days, fading more than it used to, his eyes still spoke with the same strength he'd carried all his life. They said, "You did it." Later that afternoon, Rosewood Hills stood wrapped in banners and trimmed hedges, polished for its ceremony. The graduation crowd buzzed with polite excitement, the kind that settles into the folds of folding chairs and bouquets of roses. Maya and Mona stepped onto the stage side by side, as they always had. Their gowns moved gently in the breeze, their faces calm, composed. When their names were called, they walked forward, not quickly, not with eagerness, but with purpose. Heads high. They accepted medals for academic excellence, for resilience, but it was the silence that followed which struck deepest. A pause, and then, like a tide breaking, the auditorium rose. Applause rolled forward, not polite, not expected, but thunderous. Jaden, from the 3rd row, lifted his phone to capture it, his face stretched with a proud grin. Naomi wept openly, hands clutched at her chest, as if every tear carried the weight of something long held in. Marcus clapped slowly at first, then faster, like he needed the sound to make something right again. The applause did not fade quickly. It held on, echoing longer than most, not just for their grades, not even for their courage, but for everything unspoken that had finally been seen. The walk home from the ceremony was quiet, the kind of quiet full of breath and light and everything that doesn't need to be said out loud. Sylvester trailed a few steps behind, watching the girls in front of him. They didn't skip. They didn't run. They walked with the calm of those who had already walked through fire and now recognized peace when they saw it. Sylvester watched their silhouettes, tall, certain, no longer defined by the shadows of what came before. His voice was almost lost to the breeze when he finally spoke. "No one," he said, "can call you someone else's shadow anymore." They didn't turn back, but he knew they'd heard. "You're not echoes," he added. "You're your own names now." And it was true. Not because the school had given them awards or because the paper had printed their story, but because they had earned every inch of the ground they stood on. Back home, the living room was quiet again. The medals rested on the mantel now, not as trophies, but as reminders. The story didn't end with a win, not in the way people expect. It ended with a shift. The kids who had once whispered now spoke up. The teachers who had once looked away now watched closely. And the school that had once stood as a monument to silence had been shaken, not by noise but by presence, from 2 girls, small in stature, unshakable in spirit. A storm had passed through Rosewood Hills, but it hadn't been destroyed. It had been revealed. And in the stillness that followed, something new began to grow. Thank you for walking with us through this story, one not just about 2 young women, but about the quiet strength that rises when the world tries to push you down. If this journey stirred something in you, I invite you to leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your story, or even just a word of support. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it simply stands. Until next time, keep standing.